get started? So welcome back to another installment of the Ethics Law and Society Forum. So if you haven't noticed, we have a bit of a water shortage in our state, and presumably we have a moral responsibility to do something about that. So to help us learn more about these issues, today we're welcoming in Caitrin Chappelle to the forum. Ms. Chappelle is the Associate Director of the Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center. Did I get that right? Okay. Where she manages research and operations. A little bit of background, she's worked for the U.S. Geological Survey. She has a master's in public policy from the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. And if that sounds familiar, that's because that's the same school that our previous speaker, Jack Glazer, is a professor at. So, yeah. She also has a bachelor's degree in ecology from one of the CSUs, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. So in addition to enlightening us today, she's also going to be acting as a role model about how you can make a difference in the policy world after leaving a CSU. Her own research focuses on natural resource management and California water policy. She's co-authored work on the statewide drought, funding gaps in water management, and multiple ecosystem stressors in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And today, her talk is entitled California's Water Challenges, Lessons from the Current Drought. So please join me in welcoming Caitrin Chappelle.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me, and thanks for having me to your campus. I've never been here before. It's very nice. So I think in the original title of this talk it said California's Water Challenges and Solutions, which gave me way too much credit. I can't give all the solutions, but what I am going to talk to you about today is what we are learning from the current drought and the water crisis that we're in right now. Just a little background on PPIC. We're an independent, nonpartisan think tank. It's based in San Francisco and Sacramento. And what that means is we do independent policy research on a range of California's policy challenges, one of which is water. And so what we do is it's a think tank, so we put all our brains together, we think, we pull expertise from around the state, and then we make recommendations to both local, state, and federal policymakers on what they can do to better manage water in California. So with that, I'm going to get started. So what I thought I'd do is just give you a little bit of an overview of California's water, then talk you through the current drought and some of the impacts it's having on different sectors around the state, and then finally end with some lessons learned for moving forward. So California has a very variable climate. Every year is always a little bit different. We could have lots of rain or no rain at all. So we're used to dealing year by year with a lot of variability, and we're used to preparing for both droughts and floods. This graphic here shows the normal and dry years since the previous century. So you can see that these kind of chunks of dry years have repeated themselves through time. So the drought that we're in right now is not a brand new phenomenon. California's been dealing with this since for decades. Not only is California's precipitation variable from year to year, but it's also really variable geographically. So most of the rain and snow in California, that's the left-hand map, falls north of California, in the northern part of the state. But most of the crops and people live in the bottom half of the state. So to deal with that, in the 20th century, we built a highly engineered water system to move water throughout the state of California. So who uses this water? This is everybody's favorite question, especially when water gets scarce. Everyone starts fighting over who's using too much. So if you break it down really simply between three categories: cities, farms, and the environment. Cities use about 10% of water on average, but they make up about 98% of our economy. Farms make up about 40% of the water use and make up about less than 2% of our economy. And the rest of the available water goes to ecosystems. What's really important to keep in mind about this is it's an average. In really, really wet years, when it rains a lot, the environment usually gets more, and that's because there's so much water we just leave it in the rivers and the streams. During dry years, like the ones we've been experiencing, the environment gets cut back the most because these other two users leave less for fish and other species. And right now, during this drought, all three are experiencing cutbacks. The other thing about the environmental water is in this previous graphic I showed you that shows kind of the connection of all the urban systems. A lot of the environmental water is actually in rivers and streams in the most northern part of our state, which is not connected. So there are these wild and scenic rivers up there which aren't connected to the rest of our water system. So a lot of that water is actually not even available for humans to use. So how do we determine who gets to use the water? We have a hybrid water rights structure here in California, hybrid between the water rights for both surface and groundwater. For surface water, it's based on seniority, and it's based on who got the water first or who was here first. So we have senior water rights users who have had a right to that water for a really long time, and junior water users who came in later. And so when we're experiencing cutbacks, the junior users get cut first, and then it goes up the line. For groundwater is the water that is stored in aquifers under the ground. So there's these large basins in California that fill with water, and that is land-based rights. So in the past, if you had a piece of land and you could put a well on it and dig deep, you could pump water out of that. We'll get a little bit into that in the next slide. And then the state oversees surface water, so they're the ones who say, you can or cannot pump at this time or use water at this time based on availability. But groundwater has had a limited state role so far. And what the state can do, and has in the past but hasn't done it extensively, is they can require water be used in a reasonable way, or they can require water be left to protect a public trust. And these are both tools that are used to usually protect the environment or public health reasons. So speaking of groundwater, this graphic here shows groundwater levels in 3 basins that are all in the San Joaquin Valley. So south of Sacramento, north of Los Angeles. And what they show is groundwater levels since about 1925. In this one part of the San Joaquin Valley, the Tulare Basin, which is the southern part, groundwater use has depleted these basins over time. And because of these depletions, we've seen negative impacts. It can pull water out of streams. It can make neighbors fight with each other because one guy's well goes dry and the other guy's pumping a lot. It can mess with infrastructure. It can cause cracks in roads and canals. And this extreme depletion of groundwater led to California finally reforming groundwater management last year in 2014. We passed something called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And what that does is it requires locals, so local agencies or local water users, to get together and create a plan on how they're going to sustainably manage their basins, which means how are they going to make sure that they're not taking a lot more out of the ground than is ever being put back in, either through rain or through their recharging themselves. So groundwater is a lot like a bank account. If you just keep drawing from it, and if every year you don't let more recharge, or you don't get a job and put more money into it, then it just keeps depleting over time. And so this new legislation is meant to help reverse some of these trends in groundwater use. But implementation is going to take a really long time. Locals have until 2020 to develop a plan for being more sustainable with their groundwater, and then they have till 2040 to actually be sustainable. This is getting into the economics of this a little bit. While there's been a lot of investments in water conservation and efficiency, in the same way that we've done investments in energy efficiency, so human water use has actually been flat since about the 1980s, but the economy continues to grow. So this graphic shows that the top line shows that per unit of water used, state GDP is growing. It's also growing per capita, whereas water use per capita has been dropping. So everyday water use, you and me, how much water we use in our homes has actually been going down, which has enabled us to continue growing our population across the state, because we haven't been getting more water in California. We just have to be more efficient with the way we use it. Okay, so another important piece of California water is how we pay for it. About $30 billion a year is spent annually on water. This graphic breaks that down between 5 categories: water supply, water quality, floods, aquatic, and then debt that we pay relating to the water system. And the most of this money is actually spent and raised at the local level. So I don't know how many of you are paying water bills yet, but when you do, that's where most of this money is coming from. And last year in November, California passed a water bond. Does anyone remember voting last November on a water bond? No? Not yet? All right, next time, because there might be another one soon. So what this means is the state passed a general obligation bond, which is essentially a loan that we're taking out, and we're gonna the state takes out, and we'll pay back through taxes to pay for investments in our water system. It was a $7.5 billion bond, and it passed with over 60% majority of people essentially saying we want to make the state to make more investments in our water system. Most of this money is going to go to water supply investments, that 58% there. So that means investments in recycled water, conservation, efficiency. But a lot of that money is earmarked towards storage. So either new reservoirs above or below ground. Okay, so now that's a little bit on just general. That's too much information, but that's the quick California water background. So that brings us to where we are today, which is 4 years into a severe drought. In January, this graphic shows the purple line shows reservoir storage. So these are our big dams across the state, and the orange is our precipitation. So since about January 2010, we've been seeing a decrease in precipitation, which has led to a significant decrease in our overall water storage. That blue line there is just as kind of a reference mark. In 1976 and 77, we experienced a pretty significant drought here in California, and that blue line is the lowest that our reservoirs got during that time period. So we're not quite there yet, but we're getting pretty close. The other thing, so not only has it not really rained that much, but it's been very warm. California has been getting warmer, but this last year broke all the records for temperatures across the state of California. So it's been really dry, it's been really warm, and on top of that, our snowpack has decreased. So you can think about this as kind of a third, a third, a third. 1/3 of California's water comes from surface reservoirs or rain that goes into dams. A third of it comes from those groundwater basins I was talking to you about. The other third comes from our snowpack, which when it melts over time, it lets water into streams and rivers and then into dams for people to use. And it's a really important part of how we manage California's water. This last year, we saw less than 5% of snowpack availability, which is the lowest it's ever been on record. It's lower than what climate change scenarios are predicting for the end of the century. So the temperatures, the precipitation, and the very, very low snowpack is kind of creating this perfect storm where it's a little bit of a drought of the future. We're experiencing right now what everyone was saying we're going to get to with climate change, except that's what we have right now. So we can use this. It's very scary and it's stressful, but it's also an opportunity to learn a lot of lessons, because in a lot of ways you can think that this might be the new normal, or this might be something we experience more and more over time. So that's why using this drought as a way to better to enact new reforms or to better manage our water will make us more prepared for a lot of the climate change scenarios that people are predicting. And that's Governor Brown standing in a field on April 1st, 2015, where he should have been under about 10 feet of snow. Okay, this is kind of boring, but it's a big part of it, which is money. So this year, the state and federal governments, because of the drought emergency, have given lots of money to respond to it, about $3.5 billion. But the interesting thing to keep in mind about that is most of that money, this 2.6 and this 100 here, so about 2.7 billion of that is in these water system investments that I was talking about before. So recycled water and new pipes and desalination and things like that. So these aren't exactly going to help us deal with the drought right now, but they are going to better prepare us for the next drought. The other things that they've been giving money to, and I'll talk about a little bit more, is to some of the other impacts that this drought is having, like impacted communities and farm workers. Some people have lost their drinking water supply, so safe drinking water systems. some ecosystem support, and then lastly, fire protection, because I don't know, I'm sure as all of you know, we have a much higher wildfire risk right now. Okay, so droughts in general, and any kind of natural disaster, like a flood or anything like that, help reveal strengths and deficiencies in the way that we manage our water. So in this drought, it's like any other. We've got some good news and we've got some bad news. So the good news is that so far we've had limited urban problems. So most of California's cities are doing pretty well. We've asked Californians to cut back. They're doing pretty well at doing that. So there's a lot of good news around how we're doing, as most Californians are doing every single day. And a lot of this is because in the drought that we had a drought in the late 80s and early 90s, that this was not the case, where a lot of Southern California cities and Northern California cities were totally caught unawares by the drought. And they said, oh, that's never going to happen to us again. So they spent billions of dollars since the last drought investing in ways to get us to conserve more, to build new supplies, to make connections between other water systems so that when your water runs out for your agency, you have a connection to another one and you can call them up on the phone and say, send some water over. So a lot of investments have been made to make it so that our cities are doing pretty well. The bad news is, and what I'm going to spend most of the next little bit talking about, are in these other three sectors. So we've had some painful cutbacks for farmers. We've had supply emergencies in some communities. So some people, their wells have run dry and they've lost their water supply. And then the largest impact has been on our environment. So before I get into more, I threw this slide in here to kind of talk about what happens next and what does this all mean. And I know that there's been, if you guys follow the news on water at all, I'm sure you don't get an email every day about this from NOAA like I do that says whether or not how the El Nino is growing. But there is talk of this year us having an El Nino. So an El Nino is a climate phenomenon that happens in the Pacific Ocean that has in the past sometimes led to increased rainfall on the western coast of North America. And but this graphic shows that it's actually not a super clear pattern. So the left-hand side is precipitation, so how much rain, and the bottom is the index of how strong the El Nino is essentially. So we've had really strong El Nino years that have been really wet, but we've also had El Nino years that have been kind of normal or dry. And same with La Nina, we've had which is the opposite of El Nino. So what this is saying is that while it's possible we're going to get a lot of rain this year, it's also not a very reliable predictor. And what we like to say is hope is not a very good strategy for policy. So, and the other thing about an El Nino is it's unreliable in where the rain will fall. So people are talking now that this particular El Nino might make it rain a lot in Southern California, which unfortunately most of our reservoirs where we store our water are in Northern California. The other thing that could happen this year is that El Nino is it could stay really warm. And then going back to the snowpack discussion we had, our snowpack could still be really low. So that whole source of water we would still have to go without. So even if it rains a lot this year, we might need multiple wet years to recover from our current drought. And then on top of all of that, even if we have the biggest rains we've ever had and everything gets great again, like I mentioned before, understanding how this drought's impacts have affected both our farms and our cities and our environment will help us get better for the next time we have a drought, which we inevitably will. Okay, so let's start with our cities and our suburbs. So far, like I mentioned, the investments that we've made have paid off. There's been a lot of regional cooperation, a lot of agencies working together, and the conservation that the state has asked for has been working. In April of this year, the governor mandatorily asked for 25% water conservation across the state. And that meant something different for every water agency. Some water agencies only needed to cut 10%, others needed to cut 35%. But so far, we're doing great and we're making our targets. So that's, like I mentioned before, it's been really, it's been the bright spot. But if the drought continues, so let's say we just get a little bit of rain and then it goes back to a dry year next year, or for the next drought, these supplies are going to become more constrained there's some restrictions in how we can kind of pay for water and charge for water. This is kind of wonky stuff, but essentially it's hard for us to raise water rates. And also, another interesting thing to keep in mind is when a water agency goes, okay, I need you to use 20% less water, that means they're collecting 20% less revenues, because the way they make money is they on your water rates and your water bills, right? So then a lot of times what happens is when a drought ends, water agencies are in this kind of bad spot financially because they've just spent 4 years kind of drawing down on reserves. And so there's some challenges with the way that we price water and the way that you pay for water that will need to be addressed if this drought continues. Also with the conservation mandate, like how low can you go? What's the governor going to ask for next? But overall, if the drought continues, the economic impacts for California are still going to stay pretty small. So like I mentioned before, 98% of California's economy comes out of our cities, and the impacts there have been small. So there shouldn't be a lot of worry about, California falling into the Pacific Ocean and, we're going to be okay, especially our cities and our suburbs. But where we might not be as okay are in these other 3 areas. So California has a very large agriculture economy, especially in the San Joaquin Valley, Central Coast, and up here in this area as well. Agriculture makes up a large percentage of local GDP and takes up a good chunk of jobs. So far during this drought, farmers have turned to their groundwater reserves to make up for the lack of rain that they're getting and for the lack of water deliveries that they're getting. And they've been able to pump a lot of groundwater to avoid major agricultural losses. There have been some losses, but they've been around the 2 to 5% of revenues for total ag costs. And something that's interesting is despite this drought, overall, the agricultural economy is actually growing. But if this drought continues, they'll just essentially keep pumping groundwater, but that's going to create its own problems. So we'll see more losses in acreage. The term they use is fallowing, so that means they just don't grow crops on the land that they normally do grow crops on, which leads to loss in revenues and loss of jobs and a little bit in loss of overall GDP. But again, these are pretty moderate losses, and that's because they can turn to their groundwater. But if they keep on pumping that groundwater, those issues I brought up earlier about subsidence, which is when you pump a lot out of the groundwater, lands can sink, which damages infrastructures and roads and canals and leads to high costs for that. So while farmers may be able to kind of weather this drought, it's not without its costs. The other challenging place is in our rural communities. So this map here is from the state, and it's a little bit fuzzy, but what it shows is places around the state where wells have gone dry. So where somebody's house's water supply or their small system's water supply has gone dry. And they think it's about 2,000, but it could be more than that. And so what we've had to do for these systems is we've had to have a pretty strong emergency response. So we're trucking them water, we're providing bottled water, we're trying to get them on other systems. But if the drought continues, this problem's gonna just continue and more wells will go dry. Unfortunately, it's hard to tell where wells will go dry. It's not something we're very good at predicting. So it's much more of a response. And like the state gets a phone call, my well is dry, and we have to provide them with water. The other challenging thing is air quality challenges in these rural communities. It's really dry, it's really hot. And so there's a lot of health and air quality challenges. And then these communities often are the same ones where there are farming. And then if there are cutbacks on farm jobs, then there's some economic hardship for these communities as well. So these are smaller communities, and they don't they don't have a large population within them, but they're having some pretty chronic challenges related to this drought that will likely continue. Okay, And then lastly, as far as impacts goes, the place that we have found, in our opinion, has been the hardest hit by this drought and has actually gotten the least amount of attention is our ecosystems. And by ecosystems, I mean the fish that swim in our streams and our rivers, the water birds that we have a lot of birds in California that either migrate through California and rely on wetlands in California or that they live here, and then our forests. And so what we've seen so far is just a significant reduction in the flows in our rivers and streams. We've seen record-breaking low flows across streams all across California. Our wildfire risk has gone through the roof because our forests' health have significantly decreased. So when it's really dry like this, tree health goes down, and then when their health is down, they're really vulnerable to other things like disease and pests, and all of those things add up to really high wildfire risk. And then on top of that, like I mentioned before, there's no rain and it's really hot, which helps build these wildfires. So state agencies have had to work together, and there's just been a lot of kind of like last-ditch efforts. We're taking fish out of streams and trucking them to places where there's water. We're monitoring a lot of species as getting close to extinction. For water birds, we're doing things where we're paying farmers to leave water on their crops or leave water in their fields because we know birds are going to come through. So like just leave the water there for a little longer. Things like that are having to happen across the states to try and avoid a major crisis. But if the drought continues, then we are looking at a major crisis across the state. Our prediction is that there's about 18 fish at risk of extinction if the drought continues. And the only way to help them would be to get them water or to build what's called conservation hatcheries, so places where we could breed them in captivity until the drought is over. So these are pretty extreme measures. Also, same with the water birds. If the drought continues, there'd be high levels of mortality. So as their habitat shrinks, so there's less wetlands and less water for them to be in. Same thing kind of with the trees. Less habitat, more disease, higher rates of mortality. And then again, the severe wildfire risk. The thing that's most kind of challenging and hard about this is some of the wildfires that we're seeing across the state, up here and in Southern California. They're really concerned about permanent losses to forests. So wildfire is a natural part of kind of forest health, and wildfire for a lot of forests is the way that it gets rejuvenated. But the current the current temperatures especially are making it so these fires are burning really, really hot, and they're burning in a way that is not kind of that rejuvenating wildfire way, but in that permanent damage sort of way. So I don't know if any of you remember, about 2 years ago, there was something called the Rim Fire in Yosemite. And that was an example of a fire that burned really large, really hot, and they're seeing permanent forest damage where the forest isn't regrowing the way that it should. And they're concerned about the same thing as from the wildfires we're seeing this year. And I'll get into this a little bit more, but for all of these things, if you, back here, I'll go all the way back in my slide about where the money has gone. Ecosystem support has seen, compared to the other areas, has seen some of the smallest amount. And so this is one area where upping that support would be really helpful. Okay. So, what are the lessons? So, every time that there's a drought, and in my job I get a lot of, my phone will ring or I'll get a random letter in the mail with somebody saying, I have the solution. What we should do is we should build a pipeline from Seattle, or we should truck in icebergs from somewhere else, or all these kind of silver bullet ideas of how we're going to solve California's drought. And the important thing to keep in mind is there really is no silver bullet. In California, like I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, droughts are something we're going to have to deal with a lot and over time. And it's also something that California has weathered in the past. And so in order to get better at droughts, we have to kind of stay on this idea of an all-of-the-above approach. There's no one solution. There's lots of solutions. Also, since California water supply is really just spread out across the state and every area has their own kind of challenges, each local area is going to kind of have to figure out for themselves what they need locally in order to ensure their water supply. So the solution for Sonoma is not going to be the same solution for Santa Barbara. And so what we need to think about is kind of an overall diversification of our water supply. So bringing in more recycled water. Right now, recycled water is something we could do a lot more of. Stormwater capture, which is where we capture a lot of the water that when it rains just flows down our streets and into drains. Desalination in some parts of the state. Desalination's still really expensive. Australia, when they went through a big drought, built a lot of desalination plants, and a lot of them right now that it started raining again, they're not in use. But it might be a solution for some local areas. We also need to continue managing demand. So all the things we did during this drought that have been so great, like letting go of some of our lawns and learning about how much water it takes when you take a shower, all those things. The hope is that Californians kind of hold on to a lot of that behavior, that they don't just, once it rains again, say, okay, drought's over, I'm not going to care anymore about water. We have to kind of keep doing those things, keep making those behavior changes, especially in the landscape, in the way that we use water outside. So half of the water that is used in cities is used outdoors. And so the idea, that's like a really kind of low-hanging fruit, like the grass and medians, and do we need a lawn in front of our yard and in front of our house and behind our house. So those sorts of things. The hope is, and some policymakers are finding ways to make it permanent, that's a new way of life in California. The other thing is something I haven't talked about yet, but it's this idea of water trading. So in California right now, some people will buy water from other people. Or they'll trade it with other people. But it's not something that is necessary. And by people, I usually mean agencies, not like house to house. But so like if your local agency was getting close, they knew, okay, we need this much water, they could ask a farmer, for example, I'll pay you to not grow crops this year, and I'll have that water for you. I'll get that water from you. This is something that's used a little bit in California, but it could be really expanded. And this is one way that over time we could kind of move water to the highest, value use. So if you're able to trade water, then we can kind of, without totally just restructuring who gets water when, we can kind of build a market for water. Kind of like a cap and trade, but without the cap. Just like a market for water, which we don't have a very good one right now. The other thing is to think about more water storage. So like I mentioned earlier, there was this bond that passed that has a lot of money in it for new water storage. One thing is to keep in mind is we have a lot of dams right now, and those dams, turns out, we didn't know it when we built them, have had a lot of negative ecosystem impacts. And a lot of the ecosystem challenges that we see today are because we dammed up these rivers in the last century. So when we say enhanced water storage, it's not just thinking about new dams or new above ground storage, but it's thinking more strategically about that underground storage that I mentioned earlier, and how much water we can get into the ground to use later. And then finally, modernize. California's water management system is archaic at best. In a lot of ways, we don't have the data that we need. It would surprise a lot of you to know, because you're all young and hip and able to have whatever information you want. But if I wanted to know how much water was used by who in this last year, I couldn't get it. The most recent water use data is from 2010. We're on a 5-year lag on water data right now in California. So that kind of modernization is really important, because you can't really manage things that you don't know about, and you need to measure it better. We also need to think about innovative solutions for our natural habitats. So our fish and our streams and our birds weren't doing too hot before this drought. We have a lot of listed species in California, as we have a lot of ecosystem challenges, and this drought is just making it worse. So the other thing is that when a fish gets listed or a bird gets listed on the Endangered Species Act, it's expensive to help protect them, and so it's better to protect these species before they get to a place where we're trying to avoid extinction. So what the term that we like to use is called reconciliation ecology, and it's this idea where we are recognizing that humans have made a huge footprint on California natural ecosystems, and in most places we can't just say we've got to restore it to the way it once was. But instead, what we need to do is we need to promote ways to kind of balance the two. So one way of doing that is to maybe not necessarily in a certain river putting more water in that river, but making it more natural flow regime. So thinking about the timing of the water going down or the pulses of water going down. For example, a lot of like salmon need water at a very certain time of year because that's when they're traveling up the rivers to go spawn. So think about how we can be more strategic with the water that we do have for the environment. Also, there's places where we have levees to prevent floods, which have caused really some damaging impacts to the rivers that they're on. So kind of thinking about that levee and like how can we have that levee be environmentally friendly, but also protect the houses and people behind it. Same thing with dams. There's a lot of dams across California. This is a picture of one called the Matilla Dam, for example, that aren't useful for us anymore. They are either behind the dam filled up with sediment because over years, and so they're not storing that much water. But they're just sitting there. So are there places where we can take them down? And then also you have hatcheries across California, so improving those. And then also just thinking about places where we think, okay, this is one place in California that this particular species really needs. Let's invest in that really strategically. And then the next time a drought comes along, we know that we kind of have this refuge for this species. And then this is something that, next time there's a bond on the ballot, or when you guys thinking about your water bills or where your tax money goes, this is something to keep in mind, which is that there are parts of the way we pay for California water which they don't have enough funding. Ecosystems being one of them, flood protection, and stormwater management. And this is a little bit of a complicated table, but what this is the annual gap for each of these categories. So let's just talk about ecosystems since we've spent a lot of time there. Every year, there's about $400 to $700 million gap in paying for what we need to do to maintain ecosystems and to avoid extinctions, essentially. And in that bond that passed last November, we got about $2.8 billion. So that's only about 4 years of this gap that bond can cover. So what we need is funding that is more sustainable than that, and we can't, instead of just passing a bond every 4 years, are there other taxes or fees or funding things that we can do that we can earmark for the environment and use over time. And finally, PPIC does a survey of just regular Californians, voters. We put it in the field every 6 weeks or so. And we always ask this question, what do you see as the state's top issue? And forever, since we've been doing this, for 15 years, jobs in the economy always won no matter what. Always, always, always. And sometimes water made it, like a blip on the radar. So in March 2012, 1% of people thought that water and drought was the state's top issue. In May of this year, 39% of Californians thought that was the top issue, and jobs in the economy fell to 20% for the first time ever. And I'm telling you this because as anyone in politics or policy knows, that when the public is paying attention, that's your moment of opportunity. For example, in my career, I've been doing this for about 7 years now. There's been many years where where I was talking about things that people were like, oh my goodness, that is so boring. I don't know what you're talking about. Now when I go to dinner parties, everybody wants to know about my job and the drought and tell me everything about it. So at this point in time, we have this opportunity for change because people are engaged. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens this winter with El Nino and with rain, and see what kind of changes Californians can make in the next couple years. And let's just hope that if the El Nino does come, it doesn't come with too many devastating floods, because that's the flip side of droughts in California. That's it.
So I know you talked about the whole Seattle pipeline thing.
Yeah.
People suggested it's silly, but has any of the bordering states have contributed to helping with the water supply?
So the Colorado River, which is a major source of Southern California water supply and has been for a very long time. So we don't just get so the Colorado River borders California just at the very bottom of our state, but it's a river that goes through many states, many western states. So we've that's something that we've always relied on. But the other thing that's interesting is most other Western states are actually experiencing their own drought right now too. We're not the only ones. So asking Seattle to give us some of their water is a little bit selfish since they've got their own problems.
You mentioned the farming industry. What exactly are they doing to help manage the drought? I know like the almonds, it costs a lot of water to maintain that. So what are they doing? Are they just switching crops? Are they stopping production on some things? What are they doing?
It depends. So some farmers, and it's usually the low value crops, so like alfalfa, if they don't have the water this year, they'll just not plant some acreage of that. So there's that. The thing that's interesting about the almonds and anything that's a tree, so any fruit or nut, is that farmers started switching to those in recent years because they're much higher value. So even though they use more water than, say, alfalfa, value-wise, what they get out of it is much higher. So farmers are businessmen, right? They want to use their inputs and make as much money as they can from them. So they started switching towards these higher value crops. But the problem is they're not like alfalfa. You can't just not plant a tree for a season, right? You can't just let it go fallow because they're there and you have to keep them alive. So those farmers are having to there have been situations where they have cut down orchards, but usually those are the situations where they're just pumping groundwater to keep those trees alive.
You mentioned briefly reusing water. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. The fact is that we have the technology now to return reused water cleaner than the water in nature. So it seems to me that we should make a lot more use of that. We could probably increase our effective water supply by a factor of 5 or something if we use water over and over again.
Yeah, so recycled water is definitely the kind of next big thing that Californians need to invest in. And there's a lot of movement behind that, and there's a lot of excitement about that. The thing that you have to keep in mind with recycled water is there's a lot of, so let's just imagine there's a river. And there's a water agency up here, and a water agency here, and a water agency here. If the water agency up here, and usually what happens is they use the water and then they discharge their wastewater into the river. If this water and then it's getting used downstream and it's going back in. So if this water agency up here just keeps recycling their water and never putting it into the stream, then those downstream of them just lost some water supply, right? So it's a super important tool, and I think there's going to be lots of investments in it going forward. But it's not as simple as that. Like, there's got to be some kind of regional coordination and discussion, especially on certain rivers where it's like, okay, we're going to recycle. For example, there's a river in Southern California called the Santa Ana River, where they had to spend a lot of time coordinating their recycled water efforts, so that one person upstream isn't making all these investments that leaves not only the downstream users but all the ecosystem as well, kind of high and dry. So it's a really important investment, but it's going to take a little coordination to make sure it works well.
I'm curious about the water trading.
Yeah.
I was on the California website the other day, and they had like mandatory reporting for it, and only a handful of water trades, so they sound like they must be really large transactions.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just kind of curious how that works and to whose benefit.
So most trades in California so far are from an agricultural, like senior user, so somebody who's had a right for a really long time, and it's usually an agricultural user who is trading to a city. And those are a lot of those big ones. There's a couple really big examples down in Southern California. There are some examples of city-to-city trading, but not that much. You're right, there's not a lot of, one of the things that about our water market that needs to be improved is the kind of transparency about it. So there's not a lot of information about, who's trading with who, but also that's really, it could take a really long time to get your trades approved. It's not a very straightforward process. And so it usually is, in any kind of economic market, trading benefits the person who can pay the most for it. So it's usually in these, and because water has a much higher value in cities than it does in farms, that's usually the way that it goes.
I don't know how overstated this is, but people were saying, well, I guess not people, a lot of the data was showing that over 50% of the the water was going into agriculture, and the fact that you're saying that it's growing, and the fact that you're saying that they're just continuing to pump groundwater, I'm wondering if you're as concerned as I am, or if we should calm down on that and not be as concerned.
Okay, so do you remember this? Where'd it go? Oh my god, I gave a long talk, guys. Okay. So this is our kind of water use pie, remember? So if we took out the environment, if we just like ignored the environment, which some people do when they talk about who uses how much, then yes, farms take up 80% of water use in California. The thing is that, and I'm sure it just kind of is really newsworthy, and people are kind of latching onto it. It just takes a lot of water to grow food. Like, it just as much as it takes a lot of water to kind of grow an oak tree, and just takes a lot of water. So on one hand, it just doesn't take as much water for our cities, right? So on one hand, I'm not that concerned, because if we want to have this large kind of booming agricultural sector, which we do, it's going to take a lot of water. But what is concerning is this unsustainable pumping of our groundwater use. And so the hope is with this new law that was passed last year, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, it's going to force locals to make some really tough trade-offs, which is if you want your groundwater basin to be sustainable, you might not get to either pump as much or grow as much. So locals are going to have to start making decisions about how they want to use the water that they're all pumping. But the problem with that is it could take some time. It's going to take some time. So between now and when it gets implemented, how much continued damage we do to those aquifers is a question. But yeah, so on one hand, it takes a lot of water to grow all the food that we eat, but on the other hand, they are facing some tough trade-offs.
So I believe that climate change influences drought, and drought influences climate change, and there's drought in many parts of the world, and there's climate change all over the place. So I've heard some people say in some ways it doesn't matter what we do in California unless there's a whole coordinated global response to a global crisis.
On climate change?
On a drought that's happening in Brazil, and that affects cutting down trees in Brazil, affects the drought and climate change there, which affects what's happening here, and it affects what's happening in China. So how do you get some kind of global coordination?
Well, there's kind of two ways to think about it with climate change. So it's the mitigation part of it, which is to slow down climate change, but there's also the adaptation. And what I kind of think we're learning here in California from this drought and from what we're seeing around the world is we're already in adaptation mode. We're already adapting to a changing climate right now. So most of the things that California is doing at the state level are adaptation strategies. But you're right in the sense that to slow down climate change and to ensure safe water and available water globally, it's not just a California problem. It's a global problem. I know that Western states, it's just it's not a huge scale, but I know that Western states are starting to work together on this and think about how think about what our supplies are going to look like in the future, coordinate, especially on places like the Colorado River where there are lots of states pulling from the same river. But it is a global challenge.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.